Because what we do is we do take this long view. We trace the history of interventions broadly defined that have been developed or translated to respond to gangs, gang members, gang violence, and so on. So, this is 2021. We wrote the bulk of this towards the end of 2020, early 2021. And, we devote the book to the legacy of Malcolm Klein and Cheryl Maxson, who are the two that probably weighed the heaviest on us because of their contributions to the literature on gangs, but especially this book that they wrote in 2006 that was called Street Gang Patterns and Policies. It's a fantastic book. We used to, back when I was in graduate school, jokingly called it the Gang Bible because of how much we relied on that book for our own research. Now, it's Street Gangs Patterns is the first half of the book, and then Policies is the second half of the book. And when you read Klein and Max in 2006, you can't help but walk away with a pretty glass half empty take on the state of interventions and responses to gangs. Fast forward 15 years, and I think we would all be in agreement that we're a little bit more optimistic. Since that seminal review 15 years ago, there has been a lot of progress, sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so a couple of areas to highlight for progress. One is, there has now been a rigorously evaluated prevention program, the Gang Resistance Education and Training Program, that was evaluated by one of Scott's former colleagues at the University of Missouri St. Louis, Finn Espenson, that he evaluated and found evidence that, 1 year later after this school-based curriculum, it could lower the likelihood of involvement in gangs by about 40%. James did an evaluation of the London's version of Growing Against Gangs. And while the evidence, I don't think James would describe it as positive, still, it does show evidence that prevention can be put into place. The US federal government, they have thrown their weight behind community violence intervention, not just their weight, money behind it too. And so part of community violence intervention are public health approaches, something like Cure Violence that shows promising signs, but there's this steady cadre of research that's saying, okay, let's look at non-government responses, community-based interventions. Could we do hospital-based interventions? That's also consistent with public health approaches, where you identify this point, this crystallization of discontent is usually realized, at a hospital, after you've suffered from stab wounds or gunshot wounds. Can we wrap this person around with resources to try to promote disengagement from gangs and desistance from crime? There's also movement in therapeutic interventions, where you use therapists or clinicians to intervene with kids. So for example, functional family therapy. It was translated or adapted to the gang context. Scott was involved in those early translational activities with a group, Terrence Thornberry, Denise Godfredson out of the University of Maryland. And what they do is try to improve the functioning in households by intervening with a kid and their parent. And then to take what they learn in the household and generalize that to the neighborhood, to the school, and so on, to promote more positive behaviors. And actually, in November, we're going to be starting up an evaluation here in Denver with youth on probation. There's also advances in place-based intervention. So in Los Angeles, it's called GRID, the Gang Reduction Youth Development. There is some really positive evidence that street mediation or violence eruption can result in reductions in violence in places. That came out earlier in 2020. Civil gang injunctions, again, it's suppression oriented, but there is some pretty convincing evidence that shows that they can have sustainable reductions in violence in communities. And that also ties in with things like focused deterrence in the United States, where there is a fair amount of evidence to show that focused deterrence practices can reduce violence among gangs and in communities. So there's a lot of promising work out there. Now, we hold really high standards. We expect to hold high standards because, if you're going to invest in these programs, if you're going to have taxpayers footing the bill for this, we think that taxpayers want to also have high standards just like you would want high standards in medicine before you roll out a vaccine, just like you would want high standards in many different fields. So when you look at a lot of these programs, though, they don't meet the highest standards of evidence. This is not a knock on the program. What we're trying to say here is that it's difficult to evaluate, but you've got to be able to evaluate to determine what we've learned and what we haven't learned. So for example, at my Institute for Behavioral Science, or Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado Boulder, we have what's called blueprints for positive youth development, or for healthy youth development. And it's a registry. You could go to this registry, you could identify what your population is. Is it youth? Is it adults? Is your problem substance use? Is your problem delinquency? To identify programs that are scalable. In other words, can you take it in Denver? The evidence shows it's positive in Denver, Colorado. Can you then go take it to Phoenix? Can you then go take it to another country? That's the idea behind it. And so those are some pretty high standards. You got to have, 2 independent evaluations, high quality evaluations before these programs could go past the promising label to the effective label. So what we do is to identify in the book, we organize it based on, is it community mobilization? Is it organizational developmental change, opportunities provisions, social intervention? Is it suppression? Is it prevention? And then to match up your target population with the actual intervention that's being put into place. And what we do is we review all this evidence on these topics. We try to identify some of the best practices that are in place to guide people who are then, who are looking for solutions to these problems. And so we do think that the evidence base is far more promising than it was in the past. I would imagine in another 15 years from now, there's going to be a lot more positive evidence.